Thank you very much for coming. We hope that this ends up being one of Chicago's better ideas. We're obviously interested in China and in climate change. We wouldn't approach the problem if we didn't think climate change may be an issue. So why should we care about China? Why should we care about whether we can convince China to join an agreement on climate change? Well, there are a couple obvious answers. Right? One is that China is one of the largest emitters of carbon gas emissions. So it's actually part of the problem, so to speak, just as every other country is part of the problem. But it's disproportionately so. We know China has a huge population. We also know that China is industrializing. So that basically means that China going forward is going to be a relevant part of any sort of international climate change agreement, just as the United States and some other major countries will be. So why should we think about China? Well, there are two approaches to this question. There's one set of studies that says, well, climate change is a problem. We want to address it. It's normatively preferable that over the long term, indeed, we all want to address this problem. So it's all good. Everybody should join. There's another group of studies that looks at it in question of incentives. What are the incentives for the different actors? In this example, the states. What are the different incentives for states to join a climate change agreement? So those people who look at incentives try to look at the costs and benefits, and they realize that for China, joining a climate change agreement could incur serious costs on their economy. So they promote different ways of dealing with it. So they talk about a cap-and-trade regime or side payments from the wealthier countries to China. Now, Jonathan and I certainly approach the problem from an incentive perspective, but we think there's a problem with those approaches. And the main problem is that they look at China as a unitary actor, kind of as a black box, and they don't look inside China. And when you do so, you'll find that there's tremendous heterogeneity that affects how we think about China's incentives to join a climate change agreement. And that heterogeneity focuses on economic growth and its importance to China, also on the structure of their environmental governance, also on the strength of the central authority. How can it enforce an agreement? Looking at those problems also leads to a second set of issues with respect to emissions. Are we properly looking forward and projecting these emissions? We think that the current studies don't. So Jonathan and I think that indeed the current studies overestimate China's ability to join an agreement and underestimate the difficulties that China will have in enforcing it. So to go forward, I'll talk a little bit about China's internal structure, and then Jonathan will pick up on the reasons those reasons about the internal structure actually affect our emissions projections. I should also start by apologizing, and I want to apologize because I'm going to commit a number of crimes against the Mandarin language when I try to pronounce some of these provinces. So let me apologize in advance for those of you who speak the language already and who will laugh when they hear my pronunciation. I'm trying my best. So let's talk about economic growth. Now, we say that economic growth is important for China, but isn't economic growth important for every country? Well, why would China be particularly unique? So let's look a little bit backwards to figure that out. So China historically, the governance is by the Chinese Communist Party, and it was based on a Marxist-Leninist ideology. So there's an ideological basis for Chinese governance. But what has happened? This ideology has fallen apart. The strength of this ideology is dissipated. And the Chinese Communist Party has looked to different avenues, different ways to justify the legitimacy of its regime. So what has it arrived upon? It's arrived upon an idea of performance legitimacy. That is, if we can deliver certain amounts of economic growth and we can consistently raise standards of living, then you should continue to look to the CCP as a proper governance party and not be concerned so much with democracy and other things that may actually slow down economic growth within China. So they've established that performance legitimacy is the metric to measure. So why is that different than other countries? Well, to the extent that we're in a democracy and there's no economic growth or slow economic growth, there's an outlet for our frustrations. We can vote out the people, right? We can bring in a new party. We can vote someone out. There are regularized elections. But in China, they're obviously not. So there is no vent for this. There's no vent for this frustration other than challenging the regime. And the regime certainly doesn't want to see its position challenged. So what have they done as part of this economic growth policy? Well, there's no question that China's enjoyed tremendous economic growth over the last 20 years. Depending on what study you look at, you could see 10% a year, 11% a year, 12% a year since the late 1980s. But what's interesting is the policies they adopted to actually generate this growth. So what China did in the early 80s is develop a coastal development strategy in which they liberalized market rules in certain provinces, Fujian and Guangdong, and then created 14 open cities, open to foreign direct investment. So what that did was created these areas as kind of an incubator for economic growth. That growth was not replicated in the West because the West didn't have some of the advantages these eastern provinces had. Access to different countries, access to the coast in particular. So what happened? You have tremendous economic growth over the last 20 years, but disproportionately in the eastern provinces. Disproportionate amount there due to these policies. That was combined with a policy of devolution. So the Chinese Communist Party said the only way we're going to grow the economy is not by centralized economic administration that we've done for the previous 40 years that failed. We're actually going to be able to develop it by devolving power to those entities that are best placed to make economic decisions. And those are the lower levels, the provinces, the cities, and the township villages. So as part of the policy, you have a great influence and emphasis, on the eastern provinces, and also a devolution of power. So what did that result in? It's basically created what we've referred to as two Chinas. One eastern, one western, one prosperous, one poor, one urbanized, one agrarian. So let me give you some numbers to support this. So first, the provinces with the red dots reflect those in the west. Now granted, it's not a perfect separation of east and west divided in the middle of the country. It actually corresponds to a number of economic and geographic indicators, particularly the proximity to the coast and the emphasis on those coastal regions for purposes of the policy. So what has it resulted? So what has this great economic growth resulted in? Well, let's see here. All the provinces that we have here listed, those in blue are those in the east. And look at the per capita GDP. There are tremendous differences from all those in the red, which correspond to the red dots we had on the earlier slide. So you can see there's been a tremendous growth in the east, but it's not been distributed equally. In fact, it's not even close, as we can see here. So what are the consequences of this distribution? Even more. So let's look at population. In those 15 provinces that we marked with the red, you have a population, of 574 million, GDP of 5.7 trillion, per capita GDP is 9,900. Look at that in eastern China. Those different provinces. Look at the difference. Less than half in per capita GDP. There are tremendous differences. But these economic differences also produce other things. They produce social instability. For example, you have large floating population of people from the west who want to move to the east because there are better opportunities there. You have social instability because many of the western regions contain many of China's natural resources. Almost 80% of their hydropower, over 60% of their natural gas, not to mention coal, bauxite, nickel, manganese. All these minerals are very important. Moreover, even though China is relatively homogeneous, in fact, perhaps more homogeneous than many other countries, the vast majority of its 56 nationalities live in these regions. And in some areas, there are separatist movements. So, for example, we're familiar with Xinjiang province and Uyghur separatists there. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the separatist movements, long-time movement in Tibet. So all of these have generated some social instability, and it's something that the Chinese government is concerned with. So what have they done? They're not looking at what Jonathan and I say that there's a problem. They've actually said, yes, there is a problem. So they developed something called the Great Western Developmental Program, where they're trying to invest more and more resources in the West. And they want to generate those resources and invest them in order to lift the standard of living, to negate the problems with people immigrating to the East, and also to address some of the social instability problems. So now we have a different view of economic growth. Economic growth is just not important for the sake of growth, but it's actually directly related to the ability of the CCP to govern. High levels of economic growth allow them to provide the benefits that you see for the East, but also paper over these cracks of social instability that we see in the West, in order so that these 574 million people aren't starting to think, this China isn't in it for me. There are two Chinas. One, the government focuses on the East, and it neglects the West. Now, some of you may say, well, I mean, this is a communist country, Daniel. What are you talking about? It's an authoritarian structure. You can just impose your will. Why can't the central government say, yeah, we recognize these problems, but, you know, we can impose on the provinces in a way that a democratic system can't? Well, this is actually kind of counterintuitive. The Chinese Communist Party and the central government is actually very weak vis-a-vis the provinces. And it's weak for a couple of reasons. One is because of the devolution I've talked about. They've devolved power as part of the economic process. So then what happened? Well, with economic power, you have political influence. So the provinces are much more influential on Chinese politics than the center. So here's one example of this. Here we have, you can see here, percentage of subnational spending in China. So this is what percentage of the total amount of government spending comes at the subnational level. So that's the province level, the city level, the township, village level. You can see the numbers Very, very high in the most updated numbers we can find, 72%. Compare that to the United States, 46%. So you see a tremendous amount of economic power, i.e. the power of the purse, is actually held at a lower level, not in the central government. So you have this collapse of central control. One interesting example of this is with respect to taxes. Until the 90s, the provinces collected the central government's share of the taxes and then paid the central government. So you can imagine what kind of incentives this created. They actually would meet together and sign a contract where the provinces would guarantee to provide X amount of money, and the central government would say, okay, that seems like a reasonable number, independent of whatever market forces are going on. So, and then the next year they negotiate and say, well, we want a 3% increase on our taxes. That would make sense, even though the province returns maybe 10, 20, 15%. They were not at all connected to the market. So you could see the weakness there in the central government's even ability to extract monies out of the provinces. But you also have another problem. This is probably directly related and perhaps more central, which is a problem with the Chinese regulatory apparatus. Now, there are all kinds of problems with it, and I want to focus on some of it here. This actually is a pretty reflective map of all the different agencies involved in the Chinese regulatory apparatus with respect to environmental protection. So first and foremost, let me give you a little bit of background on the structure of the Chinese ministries. So you have 29 ministries, and it's a very hierarchical structure in which the central government ministries cannot order any of the provincial ministries to do anything. Right? So they're of equal rank. But within the provinces, the Ministry of Industry, for example, in Fujian province, can order the Ministry of Industry at the city level, which can order the village level, etc. So you can see the hierarchy there. But they can't order one another horizontally. So the Ministry of Industry and the perhaps Ministry of Environmental Protection cannot issue binding orders to one another. All right? So this is one problem. Seems small relative to some of the others that I'll describe. First, how are they traditionally funded? So you have an environmental protection agency in China, just like you have one in the United States. But how is it funded? Well, interestingly, until very recently, the environmental protection agencies in China were actually lodged within the ministries of industry and Ministry of Chemicals, etc. Now, you can imagine how perverse the incentives are when indeed your bosses are those who you're supposed to regulate. Moreover, you're dependent on them for funding. So it wasn't as if, or it's not as if the environmental protection agencies within the provinces had their own independent funding source from the central government. Rather, they're actually getting their fundings from the very industries that they're supposed to regulate. Now, you can imagine kind of the perverse incentives that come out of that. Moreover, all the officials are evaluated on a metric of economic growth. So to what extent, what's the percentage of growth in your particular area? And if you've done particularly well, you're eligible for ascension and to different positions and promotion, this kind of thing. So these are some of the problems that you see in the incentive structure. Finally, and I won't go through it too much, you probably heard of problems with corruption. Around, some estimate, around 15% of GDP is lost through corruption. This obviously affects the ability of the regulatory structure to actually enforce anything. So what did this lead to? It leads a bit to what Jonathan's going to talk about. It leads to collection problems, collection action problems, and also it leads to problems that can't be addressed by changing a policy. It requires kind of a radical restructuring to fix. These problems also lead to issues with respect to projecting emissions, and I think at this point I'll let Jonathan tell us about the problems that come from this.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Daniel. So let's pause a moment and sort of take stock of where we are. So we want an international agreement that will allow all countries to regulate the production of greenhouse gases so that we can stop the warming of the Earth and not all end up under seawater. We want China to be part of that agreement because it's an enormous producer, and the agreement isn't worth very much without China being a part of it. But in the net, it's probably more costly to China to join such an agreement than it is beneficial. And so it might be that the US or other countries have to pay off China. So that's sort of our baseline, right? The problem is, of course, that it's no simple matter just to pay off China because there are things going on internal to China that simply, side payments aren't going to take care of. So, for instance, China has this enormous incentive to continue economic growth in the West, as Daniel pointed out. And how is it going to be able to do that if it's already imposing sort of greenhouse gas curbs and other sorts of regulations that harm its economy? Now, you might say, well, China could just sort of take money from the already prosperous East and move it to the West. But, of course, the problem with that is that the central government doesn't really collect the taxes in China. The provinces collect the taxes. And so it's going to be very difficult for China to convince its eastern provinces that they want to go and fund the West. And similarly, if China signs on to one of these agreements, it has to be able to enforce it, or else it's going to be punished at the national level. Now, in the US, this isn't an issue, right? If we sign a global warming agreement tomorrow, then the day after tomorrow, the EPA will get to work on regulations, and then a month after that, we'll have regulations, and we'll have federal forces that can enforce them throughout the country. All set and good. In China, of course, we've got this disastrous regulatory structure, and so who knows if the people out in Xinjiang province are actually going to be adhering to any sort of agreement that the central government has formed. The central government can't go out to Xinjiang province and enforce it because they simply don't have the power. The local people are all sort of controlled locally. The money is all coming locally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the federal government risks this sort of problem where it signs on to an agreement, this is the Chinese government, signs on to an agreement that it then can't enforce out in the West, and in addition, harms the economic development in the West, causing everyone out in the Western China to be very mad at the federal government, China. So it's the worst of all possible worlds, conceivably. So in addition to that, there's this other problem about how much we'd have to pay China to get them on board. Now, it costs money to implement greenhouse gas regulations. You're cutting down on industrial production. You're forcing people to install fancy scrubbers and the like. And there might be some benefits in terms of climate change avoided, but for China, those benefits might not be so large. So we have to pay them some money. And the amount of money we have to pay them is going to depend on how much carbon they're actually going to produce over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. Because, of course, how much they have to reduce from that baseline will tell us, what exactly the cost to them will be. If we're imposing a $25 a ton carbon tax and China's going to produce 200 tons of carbon, that's a lot of money each year and so on and so forth going forward. Okay, so the question is, how are we going to figure out how much carbon is China going to produce? And there are all these economic models out there. And what's interesting is that these economic models are all making these same sorts of assumptions about China as a unitary actor or a black box that the legal models that try to describe how China might sign an agreement are themselves making. Okay, so how do you figure out how much carbon a country is going to produce? These were all sort of mysterious questions to me until we started looking at it. So we'll skip past the first two equations because they're not very important. It's all pretty simple here, right? So these are just sort of perfect relationships between various quantities. So the amount of CO2 emissions that a country produces is equal to that country's population times its per capita GDP. So that's like saying it's equal to the overall GDP times the amount of carbon produced per GDP, right? So population is a figure we know about. Per capita GDP is a figure we know about. Carbon per GDP, this is something we call carbon intensity. And it measures sort of how efficient your economy is. So if you could imagine, sort of modern-day United States has a pretty good carbon intensity, all things considered. We have catalytic converters on cars. We have scrubbers on smokestacks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you can imagine a developing country, say, for instance, Mexico, they haven't sort of imposed the same sorts of environmental controls. They don't have the same sort of level of technology in their automobiles. They have a much greater carbon intensity. So you could have a country that produces a lot less carbon overall than the US, but actually has a much greater carbon intensity. So the key to all of this is that economists have really good projections for population. They have really good projections for per capita GDP. So now we just have to figure out how to project carbon intensity. And carbon intensity, of course, just relates to your level of technology, your level of development, and so on and so forth, economic factors. Okay, so here's how they go about trying to project carbon intensity. A guy named Simon Kuznets, about 50 years ago, came up with this beautiful bell curve, which he named the Kuznets curve. Coincidentally, of course, to describe the relationship between, in his case, inequality. He was a labor economist, and he cared about how much money people were making, and the amount of money that a country had. And you can imagine that this axis actually says time, because income per capita grows across time. And basically what he says is that as countries are developing here, they're making more money. People are starting to get wealthier, but inequality is also rising. And you can imagine this in the United States in the 1910s, 1920s, et cetera. You have these oil barons, railroad barons. There's a lot of wealth concentrated in a few hands. But he says as the country develops, there's this growing social demand for programs that will bring things back into equilibrium. We want Medicare. We want Social Security. We want things that will alleviate these great inequalities in the country. And so inequality will fall after a certain period of time. This is the theory of the Kuznets curve. Environmental economists quickly figured out that the same sorts of relationships hold when it comes to environmental quantities. So here's the environmental Kuznets curve, right? Country is developing. We're cutting down our forests and spewing smoke out of our smokestacks in order to make a lot of money. And then at a certain point, people realize, hey, we're pretty wealthy. but it's not so much fun if we don't have good air to breathe in addition. So maybe we ought to curb our rampant polluting and, and try to bring our environmental concerns back in equilibrium. So at this turning point, things start to get better, and your environmental deterioration goes down as wealth increases. So lo and behold, this relationship holds quite well for carbon intensity. So here is a graph of US carbon intensity over time, and as you can see, it traces the Kuznets curve almost perfectly. In the American Industrial Revolution, we have enormous growth in carbon intensity, meaning it's costing us a lot of pollution for every dollar of GDP we're producing. But right here around 1920, when things are really rolling in the country, everyone decides, it would be nice if I could actually go out on the city streets and take a walk as well and not have to choke and gag. Maybe we should impose some environmental curbs. Maybe we should sort of curtail our polluting, even if it means curtailing our economic development a little bit. And sure enough, as development has increased and our technologies have gotten better, our carbon intensity has fallen quite nicely. China, basically the same story. Now, this curve doesn't look quite as pretty. There's this little dip in the middle. Anyone have any guesses as to what accounts for this little gap right there? Anyone, any thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, very close. This is the Cultural Revolution right here. So this is China putting enormous curbs on its own development, reducing itself back to a prior state of industrialization, tearing things up, rebuilding, and so on and so forth. China took a great leap backwards in the 1960s and 70s, industrially, economically, culturally, in every regard. And so they fell back to previous points, and then they had to recover and undergo the same process all over again. And sure enough, China has improved quite steadily. The scales, this scale is in carbon per yuan. The previous scale is carbon per GDP. So they're not perfect. But actually, if you map these onto each other, the US is well below China. We are a lot cleaner per dollar than China is, although only recently did they actually start producing more carbon. So our economy is big, and we make a lot of money here. And so, we feel like we have this right to produce a lot of carbon. But actually, we're actually reasonably efficient, all things considered. Our dollars of GDP come at a lower pollution cost than a lot of places. OK, so this is how economists are going to try to project China's emissions. They're basically going to say, it's not any more complicated than this. They're going to say, hey, look, there's a curve. Let's just project that curve out a little bit. That's all they do. They take this curve, they draw a little line extending into the future, they project those numbers out, and then they've got carbon intensity. And once you have carbon intensity, as long as you've got per capita GDP projections and population projections, you're good to go. You've got carbon emission projections for China going out. OK, all fine and good. And here are all the various projections as to Chinese growth over the next decade. So these are yearly percentages of carbon growth over the next decade from a variety of people. These are some academics. The Energy Enforcement Information Administration is part of the Department of Energy. This is an international organization, et cetera, et cetera. They're all in this sort of 2.5% to 5% range. That's how much everyone thinks Chinese emissions are going to grow over the next decade. Here's the problem with all of that. So this is what they're doing, right? They've got this Kuznets curve for China. China's about here on the curve, and they're just drawing a little line down into the future. That's all they're doing based on this curve. The problem is that the curve they're looking at right now is really the curve for Eastern China, because as Daniel pointed out in the earlier slide, the GDP of Eastern China is 3 times the size of the GDP of Western China. The GDP per capita is double that of Western China. So Eastern China is dominant right now. So if you look at China, all you're seeing is Eastern China, and you see a curve that looks like this, and you draw your little downward line. Here's what Western China looks like, though. Western China is on the upswing. Western China is not at the same level of development as Eastern China. Western China doesn't have the same pollution problems. Western China doesn't have the same sort of societal need for cleaner air and cleaner water. Western China doesn't have the same sort of call for environmental regulation. If you read the papers, every once in a while you'll see some story about an environmental riot or some protest in China regarding the pollution of a river or the pollution of the air. They're all occurring in Eastern China, not Western China. This is what Western China looks like. The trend in Western China is up, not down. So this is what it actually looks like if you put Eastern China and Western China together and project out into the future. You have this little bump. And that bump represents what's actually going to happen in Western China that the current predictions are not picking up, because right now all the models just look like they're looking at Eastern China. So this gap, this little hole here between the dashed line and the solid line, is the extra emissions that we can expect to get from China over the next 10 years because of the fact that Eastern China and Western China look so different, and these distinctions are getting washed out in the conventional models. So what's really great about this is that we found a couple of economists at the University of California at Berkeley who got their hands on some better data. Now, the typical economists are just looking at national level data. So all they see are variations within China as a whole. So all they're seeing is this. These guys had province level data. So they're able to see what's going on in every different province all throughout the country of China. And so they're able to pick up when the curve looks like this. In fact, they can see places where the carbon intensity is actually increasing rather than decreasing. And so they went out and published some projections of their own. And I should say, they have this data that you can use to demonstrate that certain places are behaving differently than others. They don't really have any understanding of why or the legal ramifications or the sort of geopolitical situation that's causing it, which is, of course, where we come in. So here is the final projection. Offhammer and Carson project about 11% emissions growth over the next decade, more than twice as much as any of these other models. And of course, they're the outlier, so they're being treated right now exactly as every outlier is always treated, which is to say that all these people are denouncing these guys. And who knows, right? We're not economists. We haven't rerun these numbers. It might very well be that Offhammer and Carson turn out to be wrong and that all these folks are correct. But we think it's much more likely that this assumption that everyone else has been relying on, this assumption that China is a unitary state, is what's in fact completely wrong, and that only by looking at the subnational level, only by looking at the provinces, do Offhammer and Carson realize the mistake. So the fear here, and I should say this is genuinely a fear because we would like the Earth not to boil over, is that Offhammer and Carson are correct that Chinese emissions are going to grow much more over the next couple of decades than anyone believes, and that as a result of that, the US is going to have to pay China all of this extra money. And side payments from the US to China to get China to join us in a global climate agreement are pretty darn controversial right now. So Professors Sunstein and Posner and Weisbach have been writing a lot about this also. There have been proposals of this sort for a long time. American government, for fairly obvious reasons, is pretty resistant to this. We see China as a rival, not necessarily a friend, and the last thing we want to do is be funding China to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars per year to get them to join the sort of climate agreement that we think they ought to be joining in the first place. So if this is true, the price is actually a lot higher than everyone realizes, and the chances that we're going to be able to strike some sort of a reasonable deal are that much smaller. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that one of the big problems with this sort of agreement is that even if we are going to go ahead and pay China some money, it's not clear that China can even do with that money what it wants to do. So the way that these sorts of things typically work is that if some country is getting benefits and receiving costs in some way, you want to redistribute the benefits across the board so that everyone is at least as well off as they were. This is the Pareto Principle, which you may have encountered in class. Make everyone just as well off, and you've got some left over, and spread that around to people. So in the US, for instance, if we suppose we imposed a big carbon tax in the US, right? That would hit people who drive a lot disproportionately. Those people might be poor disproportionately. We wouldn't want to just have them bear the full penalty of the carbon tax. We would take the money we made from the tax and redistribute it to these poor people so that they're at least as well off as they were before. Now, if we were to strike some climate agreement with China, there are going to be some benefits in Eastern China. Eastern China will become cleaner. Eastern China will have less worry about flooding and other sorts of environmental problems. But a lot of these development costs are going to fall on Western China. Western China is where all the new electrical plants are being built. Western China is where they don't have the money to put fancy scrubbers on everything. So you've got all the benefits in Eastern China. You've got these costs in Western China. So the obvious thing to do is to transfer the benefits from Eastern China to Western China, even things out so that everyone's just as well off. Of course, the big problem with this is that, first of all, these benefits are not easily monetized. How do you sort of take someone's reduced risk of flood and turn that into cash? Okay, well, you might say, well, you'll just tax them. You'll just start imposing taxes on the people of Eastern China. And that returns us, unfortunately, to the earlier problem that Daniel pointed out, which is that, of course, the taxing authority of the Chinese central government is simply not up to the task at this point. They simply don't have the capacity to go to Beijing and Shanghai and take a lot of money out of the pockets of the people there and move it out west. The local governments are not going to allow it. The central government doesn't have the force to be able to make those sorts of moves happen. So, regrettably, our picture is really quite bleak. So we find ourselves in the slightly awkward position of advocating for a much stronger Chinese central government and an entire fisted control over the provinces, which I don't really quite know what to make of. And certainly we hope that the provinces will sort of see the wisdom of an international agreement and want to join on themselves. But I think our bottom line is that it's complicated enough to think about the United States and China getting together and forming a climate agreement if we think of them as just two solitary, unchanged, homogenous nations. It gets a lot tougher the minute we start to sort of pry open the Chinese black box and look at actually what's going on within the country itself. So I think that's all we have. We would be happy to take your questions now. Yeah, Josh.
Another way to look at this very, very bleak situation is perhaps that maybe there is this opportunity here that one of the ways it's been suggested to do a side payment is not necessarily just cash, but technology transfer. And that's actually very attractive to U.S. companies, because that's actually a way in which the U.S. could perhaps benefit from what we'd otherwise see as a side payment. And you also have the advantage that because in the West there's just less development, fewer power plants, and just fewer technologies adopted, overall that maybe technology transfer could provide a way forward that would both leapfrog Western China and solve these these sort of international negotiation problems. Of course, it's forcing China to buy U.S. technology or European technology, but that might be a way forward.
Yes, we like that idea a lot. We actually come out in support of that idea in the paper which this is based. The only problem is that it sort of relies on this kind of false consciousness within the American government, which is to say, the typical way that this would work is that we're going to provide China with lots of technology credit so they can turn around and go to U.S. companies and buy scrubbers from us or buy cleaner coal technology or whatever else. And so in the end, this is still the American government writing the Chinese government an enormously large check. Now, that check has to be plunged back into American industry, so it makes it a little bit more palatable, but it's still a very big check from our government to theirs, and I think that there are a lot of people in our government who are opposed. So we think that that might be the best way forward, but we're not, I would say, hugely optimistic about it. Yeah?
Could cash deals be struck on the provincial level with the U.S. making payments directly to provinces instead of to the national government of China?
Yeah.
The same problem, that's a good idea. I mean, the same problems would exist in paying the provinces that we have when paying the central government. And that we don't have as much confidence that the provinces are any better in using these monies toward the end that we want. In fact, since the provinces have make the majority of the spending, around 70%, the majority of the corruption actually occurs at the provincial level. So it's unclear that even if we gave them money and said this money is for the purposes of X, that it'll actually be spent on that. So it gets us closer to the locus where we want, which is at the lowest level. But the corruption problems and the confidence we would have in the money actually getting to where we want would perhaps would still be problematic.
Yeah, countries don't like it when you try to deal with regional governments, right? So imagine if the city of San Francisco tried to strike a bargain with Thailand or something like that. I think the U.S. government would sort of go crazy about this. And the same thing is likely to occur in China. And plus, we can make the deal, but then how do we enforce it, right? So we make the deal in Western China, and then as Daniel says, they don't use the money properly. So what's our recourse? I mean, our recourse is probably against the central government of China. We can impose trade sanctions or something, but that's going to hit central China, not Western China necessarily. So it becomes a difficult feat to pull off, even if the Chinese government were willing to do it. Natalie?
Not to be overly pessimistic, but do you see any parallels to the U.S. in this model in that we now have a greater division between rich and poor in this country, and that any economic programs that we have are going to probably disproportionately affect jobs that are genuinely less lucrative jobs in the first place? And so even implementing a plan would be difficult to the U.S. as it would be for China for those same reasons.
Well, I would say that the U.S. is much better off with respect to being able to impose an agreement within the United States. And I think the U.S. is probably better off in that the distribution of economic growth certainly is not as skewed as it is in China. So we don't have a clear winner and loser with respect to regions, and then those regions having problems vis-a-vis the center. I guess it's conceivable that the technologies that we would use to actually reduce carbon emissions would come from, or are produced by people who have jobs that have a certain income level, and that perhaps if they're in factories, et cetera, in industries where perhaps we're not as strong anymore, the costs of those industries go up, and perhaps they don't employ as many workers. I'm not sure on the whole if that's exactly what would happen. I'm not sure if those new jobs couldn't be done by other workers. In fact, I'm not sure that it means that it may expand our opportunities with industry, right? Knowing that we're not polluting as much, perhaps we expand that base. But I'm not sure we can draw an implication from this that would directly apply to the United States situation. But I'll let Jonathan.
Yeah, right. I mean, Natalie, I think we agree with the thrust of your question, I think, but the difference in the United States is that our central government is simply a lot more efficacious when it comes to dealing with these sorts of problems. So we have much greater capacity to tax and then spend for the right people. We have a much greater capacity to distribute wealth geographically or just to certain income classes as it's necessary. It's much easier for us to move money around within the country. And so if, in fact, this is a climate change agreement is a net winner for the U.S., it's much easier for the U.S. to make it a net winner for all parts of the U.S., if in fact we want to. Now, maybe we won't want to. There might not be the political will for it. But at least sort of as a practical matter, we have the capacity to do it. And it's not clear China even has that at this point.
I should add just, and I didn't mention that China delegates the social service capacity to the provinces. So the provinces that would be hurting the most from the climate change agreement also are responsible for providing the unemployment benefits and those benefits to those workers that are displaced because of the lack of economic growth or the jobs that may be eliminated. So there's a double, it's very hard for the provinces to do it because it comes out of their money. Imagine these Western provinces with this kind of GDP. Where's the revenue to actually to address those concerns? In a way that, as Jonathan pointed out, we can do it in the United States. We can shift those monies around. Maybe in Shanghai they can, but it would be hard to imagine where it really hurts in Gansu if that's possible. I think there's a hand up there. Yeah.
So I was wondering, based on your guys' modified bell curve, how long until China would just on its own get to the point where it's really good for them to get to the top of the curve, basically? Is it? I mean, it seems like it's not too long. Then it might be worth waiting.
Yeah. So I think there are two separate questions there, right? So one question is, how long will it be until China demands environmental protections of its own and its own carbon intensity starts going down? That's already happened in eastern China. That's been going on in eastern China for a while. Western China, it may be a little ways away, but it's not clear how far. The second question, though, is at what point will sort of imposing carbon curbs be net beneficial for China as a whole? And the answer to that is much, much, much further into the future, right? It's simply a matter of where China is located in the world and the prevailing winds and the latitude and the whole deal. It's just not as important to China to avoid global warming as it is to a lot of other countries. So even if there are sort of modest curbs in the West, even if carbon intensity starts going down in the West, we're still a long ways away from a point where China would really be interested in joining a climate agreement on its own. And so therefore a long ways away from reaching a point where we wouldn't have to pay China off or do something else in order to induce them to participate with us.
And if I could just add, part of the issue is that some people say it's just too soon, it's too early. So they don't say it's too early that we should quit thinking about climate change. It's too early in that all the interests among the major states that are actually producing high levels of carbon are aligned. And if it's too early, that's the problem that will drive all of these agreements. And in some ways, what we've done is actually show why, perhaps in China, it may be too early. Now, we're not saying that's normatively preferable that it's early, but in that may be a fact of life. Yes? Or should we? Go ahead.
The first one was, wouldn't this whole process be accelerated for Eastern China to respect Western China and way northeast to the U.S. as some other places that have plans? And in some cases, they say they're able to influence factory policy and say in the Midwest or so forth, even though northeast is far away. And the second thing is, can we use the consumer power of the U.S. just a way that we tell companies, well, we have to go to the FDA, we have to do all these things before we get your products on the market. It doesn't have to be those basic, right? We can impose any restriction on any country and say, well, this has to be produced in Western China, this has to be produced in these ways, otherwise you don't get access to our market. Our market is the biggest in the world. And even though, there might be an arbitrage argument, but basically, for most companies in the country, they can't afford to say, not comply with something that is involved in access to.
Can you say a little bit more about how the Northeast controls factories in the Midwest? I'm not sure I understood that, the point though.
Well, I've read this before. I'm trying to think like a specific example. Yeah.
So it's simply that the effects of pollution in one place spill over into other places? Exactly.
Right. So I think the general argument is people in the Midwest and South complaining that all this environmental regulation have an illusion that the producer of the Northeast is dictating all this policy because it doesn't hurt them to have more taxes.
Well, I mean, to the extent that the Northeast is able to do that, that's just as a result of the fact that the United States has this powerful central government that regions, when they're acting, in concert and great strength, can have a large influence on. I mean, that's sort of part of the problem is that China doesn't have that same sort of capacity.
Yeah, the province interests aren't aligned. In fact, there's a high level of local protectionism. I, in Province A, don't want to absorb the cost of helping out Province B, right? Particularly when I'm being measured on a metric of economic growth. Now, in theory, what you're saying is that maybe Province B says all these problems that Province A are creating are such that we want somebody to go and address the problems with Province A. Well, Province B doesn't have the resources to do it, and at this point, the central government doesn't have the capacity to actually enforce that. It's part of the problem, again, when we look at countries that have relatively stable democratic governance systems in which a lot of these compromises have been worked out through a central government, where there is obviously a central government in China, but it's not nearly as powerful, nor are the grand compromises among provinces been addressed.
And very briefly to your second point about using American consumer power, I mean, what you're proposing is to ignite a gigantic trade war, effectively. I mean, we can certainly do that, but China would undoubtedly respond. And I mean, it might be that
it's not a one-way lever here that we do this.
We may try this at some point. It's not completely out of the question. But the first people who would be hurt are American consumers. You know, if you go to Walmart and the shelves are empty, people aren't going to be so pleased about that.
But your point's well taken that there are some scholars who actually believe that this perhaps may be a way, and there's a first step to looking at it. So your idea is good.
Read.
How do you reconcile the weak central government theory with the recent reports about 600 billion, 700 billion stimulus plan from the central government?
A great question.
Good question. Yes, there was a recent $600–700 billion stimulus package, of which 20% came from the central government. The rest of it was they encouraged the provinces to chip in and meet this amount commensurate with their needs. So even those announcements, and we found it actually interesting when we read it because it was in small print. China announced a stimulus package, central government pays 10%. So, but it's a good question. The central government is facing these problems right now, and it's actually important to think about the financial crisis because we're not sure which way that cuts. So maybe the financial crisis means lower levels of productivity, which are lower levels of production of carbon emissions. Maybe that's a good thing. Or it just means that the tenuous relationship between economic growth and environmental protection actually goes strongly in favor of economic growth. So let's let's put these things aside. We need to address other issues.
I think it cannot be overstated how preposterous what China did is. I mean, imagine if President Obama announces Congress passes $1 trillion stimulus package, and in fact it's $100 million of federal money, and then they say, okay, California, you're going to pay $150 million,
yeah.
Illinois, another $150 million from you, right? This is effectively what occurred.
We call it unfunded mandates.
Yeah, right. I know. This is the largest unfunded mandate in the history of central government action. Yeah.
So you go to the U.S. environment curve.
Sure.
I guess my issue or question has to do with the use of the environmental curve for carbon and the causal story that it tells. Basically, in that the causal story here suggested that in 1910, income was increasing, so people demanded carbon regulation. When I've never heard of any demand for carbon regulation until Al Gore in the 80s or 90s. So I guess, and that's basically because the effects of the carbon pollution are so long-term that, it ends up being some cultural phenomenon, people getting together to say, this is a problem, we should do something about it, and not as much we observe this day to day, and so that's why we need to respond to it. So I guess, how do you deal with that, or how do you explain that with this?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's important to emphasize it's partly sort of a social phenomenon when these curves turn around. It's partly just a technological phenomenon. So right around 1910, we were simply building more efficient cars, right? People had sort of figured out the internal combustion engine a little bit more, and gas mileage started to get a little bit better. And secondly, it's true that we haven't talked about carbon dioxide regulation until recently because carbon dioxide doesn't really affect our day-to-day lives, right? But people have been talking about regulating carbon monoxide and smog and all sorts of other various pollutants for a much longer time because that's
even before Al Gore created the internet.
Right, exactly, right. That's stuff that hangs, right, stuff that hangs around in the ambient air. So we've had catalytic converters on cars which exist to convert carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide for decades upon decades upon decades, and that's the sort of thing that was occurring back then.
Also, think of this as kind of a correlation. There's not necessarily some causation here, and that at the moment this happens, there's a a causal mechanism that actually directly related to another. We're just showing basically a strong correlation between certain levels of economic growth and the importance of regulating the environment.
How much will reduce capital?
Is that fair? Can you do that? Can you answer the question? Okay.
It's the privilege of the camera.
Yeah, evidently.
Reduce carbon intensity actually matter if the Chinese economy keeps growing at the pace that it's been growing in terms of mitigating climate change?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is sort of a fundamental point to understand, right? So, on a per capita basis, the U.S. right now is very rich, and China, despite all the recent growth, is not nearly as rich. And so the U.S. wants to sort of freeze China in its current state and say to them, okay, that's great. We're all just going to sort of continue along as we are. We'll continue to be very rich. You can continue to be very poor. Not surprisingly, China's not such a fan of that idea. And so they believe that they have this right to continue growing. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to ever persuade China that they have to curb their economic growth in some way. So if China's going to continue to grow, I think that's an inevitability. The only option is to bring down Chinese carbon intensity and bring it down substantially. So it's obviously not it's not a full solution. We're not going to reverse all of these trends, but the only way to keep Chinese emissions from growing completely out of control are to reduce their carbon intensity, because we're not going to stop the growth in per capita GDP.
If I could add to that, the position of the United States going into the negotiation for the Kyoto Protocol was one that everybody freezes their emissions as they are now, in the aggregate. And the Chinese and many other developing countries, India, for example, said, this is ridiculous. We have a huge population. Our per capita production of carbon is much, it's very low. How can you say effectively, our economies must stop here while you've already industrialized? In fact, you've already made all your contributions to our carbon mass, right? We haven't even had a chance to industrialize. So that position was, there's obviously a fundamental difference there. And the developing countries, China included, refer to this as common but differentiated responsibility. We all have a common responsibility, but it's differentiated given our existing contributions to the carbon emissions.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Scholars have proposed like a buyout or even carbon credits, or I mean the technology credits, and paying China that way. How does that affect other countries being less likely to buy in out of the goodness of their heart and want a U.S. buyout as well? Or I guess where do the other countries fit in this picture? It's not just a U.S.-China kind of bargain.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Obviously, our focus is on China here. Part of it is because China has a very unique economic growth structure, particularly its distribution of wealth, et cetera. Not all countries have this distribution. But your question is relevant because there are many other countries, India, for example, and all other newly developing countries that are going to encounter something like this. Now, the reason that we're focused on China, that much of the literature is driven by China, is that it's so much larger and it's leading in the production of carbon emissions. But those questions would have to open the box in many of these other countries and see exactly what's going on. Some actually may be more amenable or may be closer to the point where it's net beneficial to actually sign on. Others may be farther away. And it's hard to say looking into it, but you're right, your instinct is right that we have to look at other countries and think about it the same way.
So what we're going to need, I mean, there will have to be an international agreement that covers essentially every major economy in the entire world. And when everyone sits down to hammer this out, they're going to look at the benefits of an agreement and the cost of an agreement to each individual country, because no country is going to sign on if the costs are higher than the benefits. So the trick is to figure out where there are countries that have higher costs than benefits and what we need to do to bring them on board. And no country has a greater disparity between costs and benefits than China does. And no country is a more important participant in the agreement than China is. So we're going to have to pay China off in a big way. We're not going to have to pay off India because their benefits would actually exceed their costs from such an agreement, and so on and so forth.
Yes,
I
Taylor.
think that the provinces in Western China are already anticipating this big wealth transfer and sort of building less efficient coal plants than they would because they're expecting that somebody else is going to pay for it in 20 years.
That's an interesting question. I don't think we have any information about what's motivating it other than a desire for economic growth. It's unclear that they're actually delaying any sort of process or building intentionally inefficient industries or factories just for the purpose of anticipating a long-term payment. It's hard to know exactly what officials see. In our paper, we did some work and we looked at some of the kind of interviews, the kind of first-person interviews of officials in the Western provinces and even people, and many of them have said in a binary, if the question is posed as a binary, more economic growth versus environmental protection, people in Western China generally prefer more economic growth. So I don't think there's any intentional desire to build something inefficiently. The idea is we need economic growth. We want to improve our quality of life and they're just simply not at the same place as Eastern China is on that curve.
Yeah, if they're thinking about it at all, they're thinking about it probably in exactly the opposite terms, right? Which is, if someone's going to come along and pay us a lot of money to build clean factories, then we should start building some clean factories and think about that, and maybe even hold off production until we get that money. They don't think that anything's going to happen. Nobody's going to come riding to the rescue with money, and nobody's going to come riding along with regulation to block them. So they're just going to go ahead and proceed with the building of whatever is cheapest and most effective for them out in Western China, with sort of without respect to what anyone else in the world is going to do, because they assume that there is not going to be any substantial influence of either money or regulation forthcoming. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Do you have concerns about healthcare costs? Like their own domestic effects and costs,
In Western China?
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. But again, they're weighed against the other costs. So, for example, in the earlier chart, we saw what the GDP is, the GDP per capita for different provinces. It's very low. So you have actually a small amount of resources. The central government has then devolved all these responsibilities to these provinces. They simply don't have the resources to invest in all these things. So the quality of care is already very low, and this is actually a problem throughout. Now, do they care about these things? Yes. But it's, do you care relative to your own? You have a number of different priorities, and what can you achieve? One huge problem is the fact that not only are they poor, but also they have the responsibility for the provision of social services that often in many other countries are provided by the central government.
Great. Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.